Now, there are two concepts here: data fiduciary, which is the person who really determines the purpose and means of processing personal data, and maybe hands it over to a data processor who is processing the personal data on behalf of the data fiduciary. The bill places a set of obligations on both. How do you believe, once this bill in this shape becomes the law, it will improve the rights of the users or the life of the users, where today we're just, sort of mindlessly giving access to a lot of our personal data?
Look, I'm sorry to say, I don't think it's going to stop. GDPR, the most detailed, onerous regulation in the world, has been enacted. When it was enacted, we all got little pop-ups saying, please accept. After the first three, we all accepted. We didn't take it any more mindfully, and we still do it with the cookie pop-ups. So this is the fundamental problem with a consent-based framework. And I think if you're expecting this to be a magic bullet, I don't think it's going to be a magic bullet. From an autonomy perspective, I think the fact that we have a law which now has some teeth, it actually has consequences, and there are various compliance obligations, like if you are above a certain threshold, you have to appoint a data protection officer. There are things now that companies need to do, and just the fact that there are obligations that they have to follow is going to make our lives safer. I think from here, we need to see what the Data Protection Board will do, because a lot of the implementation of this is going to come from, a lot of the guidance the Data Protection Board is going to give that companies will then need to abide by as they go forward. So I think this is sort of certainly much better than the position that we had. As you know, we have rules under the Information Technology Act that are completely toothless, because you've got rules, it's got obligations, but not complying with those obligations have absolutely no consequence. So if you want to know what it has made better, at the very least, it is this. It is a proper statute, which has got a regulatory framework and it has got consequences. That, to my mind, is enough.
Okay, I'll come to the consequences. They've sort of, if you remember, of course, the earlier drafts had the distinction between personal data and critical personal data. That distinction here is gone. A fresh distinction in terms of fiduciary has been added, and sort of, I think it's coming from what we have in the social media platform stage, where there is a data fiduciary and a significant data fiduciary. And the significant data fiduciary will then have a data protection officer. They'll have to have some audit mechanism, independent audit mechanisms. But how that significant data fiduciary will get sort of categorized, there are a bunch of sort of grounds for this, about pertaining to the volume of data that you are sort of processing, the kind of data, and etc. etc. And if, let's say, to the extent of even saying that if the data that you're processing has electoral consequences, all of that will make you a SDF. What is the purpose of making this distinction, Rahul? Because the person who is processing data of 10 individuals versus who's doing for 1,000, shouldn't both have the same standards?
Yes, they should. And look, I think we need to see what thresholds are. But once again, this concept of coming up with a different category of, in the European context, it's a data controller, is not new. If you look at Europe's new digital strategy, they have a very similar framework. They have a categorization of, I think they also call it significant data controllers, but they have a category of regulations that would apply to people, to entities, because of the nature of their business and the impact that they could have on a large number of people. And if you think about it, there are many ways in which you could say that data protection or data businesses could harm people. But one of the biggest ways in which they could harm people is harm people at scale. Because at that, when they're harming people at scale, it's actually very difficult to control them. People in all parts of the planet, people in all parts of the country could be affected by the decisions of a significant data fiduciary, and there is a reason to therefore go after them. This doesn't mean that you don't go after the small ones, but when you are trying to make sort of a utilitarian decision as to where to deploy the resources you have more bang for the buck going after those that can make a bigger difference to a larger number of people. And I think that is the purpose behind this. I don't think, in a sense, it dilutes the obligations on everyone else. It just places this category at a higher bar and obliges them to do more, which is fair. And it's, once again, it's not uncommon in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there is, I can see some logic in terms of saying that, look, smaller businesses, why place these onerous requirements on them and let the big ones sort of,
I think we need to make a distinction, because small businesses still do have obligations, regardless of your size. You have obligations.
Yeah.
If you cross a threshold, you will have more obligations. What are those obligations? Those obligations are, you have to designate someone to whom we can complain if there's a problem. Nothing wrong with that. You have to conduct audits. Nothing wrong with that. Now, those are the sorts of things that perhaps you don't want to burden a small business with, because it costs to create a person and a job just for the purpose of receiving complaints. So I think those are the sorts of additional obligations that I think are quite reasonable with regard to large businesses.
Okay, just to circle back to my original point, why have they done away with the critical personal data versus personal data distinction? As in, do you see the logic in not defining it or making these two categorizations and then just clubbing everything into the data set, or rather definition of personal data?
Yeah, look, I mean, okay, so I want to be clear that you're asking me the right question, because critical data was something that was, Justice Sri Krishna introduced into the law, and he himself, when I asked him, said, I wish I had defined it, because it remained undefined. It remains undefined all the way until the 2021 draft. So no one knows what critical personal data means. Perhaps what you mean is sensitive personal data, because sensitive personal data has been in the law since the beginning. It is a slightly higher, has a slightly higher threshold, and there is a legitimate argument as to why we haven't distinguished between personal data and sensitive personal data. I think the point really is that sensitive personal data, there are some categories of data that require greater protection, and so do we classify them, give them a little more protection? Perhaps prevent them from being transferred out of the country to unfriendly nations, things like that. There is certainly an argument for that. Once again, as I said, this is a country that needs training wheels as far as its data protection law is concerned. The only protection that we can really reasonably offer sensitive personal data is what we call explicit consent. If you have read my writings and you have talked to me on numerous occasions, I don't hold much store with the protection that consent provides. So if I don't hold store with the protection that consent alone provides, I think explicit consent is not going to really give me that much more safety. Instead, what it is going to do is put fetters on what we on the way we work. How should we go from here? I think certainly as the regime matures, as the regulator comes to grips with all the things that India needs, we should absolutely consider some sorts of personal data as deserving of more protection than others. But we need to do that in the context of what our regulatory enforcement mechanism is, what our infrastructure is to be able to actually give people this meaningful protection. Otherwise, right now, there is zero protection for any form of data. Let's at least get that sorted. And once we've got that sorted, we can move up the chain to get greater protection for others.
No, I'm saying that the concept existed until the last draft. So, I mean, why do away with it? Because like you mentioned that...
It's all theoretical, Payaswini. Until it actually comes into force, it doesn't exist. I mean, I've been looking at these laws since 2012, and all of these things have existed. I don't necessarily fault this law because they have just one definition. It would have been nice if there are two. I can understand the thinking of the government, which is we are going to have a tough time getting this off the ground. We are, just remember, for a country our size, we are literally the last country in the world to have a data protection law. I think there are some minor countries that don't, but a country which is so digital first to not have a data protection law, we really have to catch up. And I think we need to get the basics done. And so I'm not going to fault the government for having just personal data. I think we need to move. And once we move, once we see how it works, we can add belts and braces, we can add additional provisions at a later point in time.